Cool, thank you. Hi.
Hi.
All right, so yeah, I'm Jeff of the Salt Lake Climbers Alliance, and this is basically my master's project I worked on. And so I've got a lot of information, so I'm going to kind of go through it pretty fast. But the whole idea here is to give you guys a foundation of what monitoring is and the uses for it. And we're going to talk about different types of impacts that I'm interested in, and different types of assessment systems that you can use to monitor recreation impacts.
Cool.
Thank you. Okay, first thing, what is monitoring? Simply put, monitoring is the period and the systematic measurement of key indicators of biophysical and social conditions. So the big question you have is like, why bother monitoring bouldering areas? Like, what's the use of it? Well, the first thing is that it allows entities to gather reliable information, and these entities are the federal land agencies, local, state level, and also local climate organizations. It's also a tool to gather reliable information just for us to get out there and see what we need to do. It's also an integral component of the Forest Service's limits of acceptable change and the National Park Service's visitor use and resource protection, known as VERP. And these are pretty important management tools for recreation that should be used. They sometimes are put into place, other times they're not. But the big idea here is that you address visitor management issues using the LAC or the VERP systems. Now, initially, before that, they would do carrying capacity was the paradigm they were using, and that's looking at an area and deciding how much use could an area handle by the amount of people that could go to it. Well, pretty fast we realized that it really didn't matter how many people were using one specific site. What really matters is user behavior on a site opposed to the amount, because you can have one little site and you can have 20, 40 people go in there and maybe have minimal damage, but you can also have one person that would go into a site. It can cause a lot of damage if that person chose to do it. So they realized that the carrying capacity paradigm just completely failed. And then they developed this idea of looking at more of the question of what resource and social conditions are appropriate or acceptable, and how do we attain those conditions. So that's the key thing here. And this, whoops, go back. This little graph over here is pretty simple on how the LAC and the VERP system works. And monitoring is a key component of it. You can see right there, monitor conditions is right in the middle of this thing. So really fast here, the idea for lab managers is to first you establish these prescriptive management objectives. This can come from your management plans. And you're going to select indicators of resource and social conditions that you want to keep either presently or future conditions. You're going to specify standards for these indicators. And we're going to talk about indicators a little later. And then here's the thing. You want to monitor these conditions. You want to go out and you want to see exactly what you have on the ground. And you want to come back later and see what you have later on. So, and that's where you come to compare conditions to the standards after you monitor it. And here's the fun part. So if the standards exceed that you have up here, you can evaluate and identify the factors that are causing it, and then you implement management actions. And then from there, you go back and you monitor the conditions again. I think the funny part is that if it's not working for you, you can also go back all the way to top, and you can establish new prescriptives if you need to. So it's probably better to not have to go back up here and redo it. So also, if the standards are not exceeded, which is great, again, you go back over and you wait over time and you monitor the condition again. Okay? So that's just a little bit about the LAC and the VERP. Other reasons to do monitoring is it allows managers to maintain formal records of resource and social conditions over time. Data points inform changes in conditions rather than informal perceptions of change. This is really important. I've people in the Wasatch I talk to, they'll always say to me like, oh, I remember when this trail used to be this small. And I remember when this boulder problem used to be a lot shorter. But there's no data showing exactly when these changes have occurred. And really what they say and what they sense really doesn't matter. It has to have just some quantitative data. It's much better to have than qualitative data from that. Monitoring helps maintain and understand in a relative objective way if the action addressed the problem. In other words, was the action effective? By having a system set up, you can go back and figure out what we did to mitigate this problem. Is it helping? Develop and evaluate resource protection objectives, strategies, and policies, and to meet desired future conditions. And it's also, you can assist land managers with the NEPA process by having a monitoring system in place. And just previously over in room C, we were talking about the NEPA process, but environmental impact statements and environmental assessments, there's key components when you're writing them. So one of them is the objectives. So whatever you want to do for your project, example, trail system, trailheads, et cetera, it's good to have a baseline assessment of what you have already on the land to decide on what objectives you would like to do. Indicators are also necessary, and that is you want to have quantifications to ensure environmental consequences. And another key component of EISs and EAs is mitigation measures. And this is where you'll see monitoring pretty much always. If you're going to put a new trail in, part of your mitigation measures, you're going to say, hey, we're going to put a monitoring system together, and we're going to look at, if doing that trail, if there's environmental consequences in the future. So it doesn't matter what kind of monitoring system you put in. I mean, we're going to go over the different types, but the better you have, the more thought you put into it, the better it's going to be. Okay, so those are some of the reasons why we want to do monitoring. There's also reasons not to do monitoring too, but I don't want to go into that. So let's look at specifically at bouldering areas. So spatial components of bouldering, there's 5 distinct zones. And just getting an understanding of where these zones are at, you can see where the impacts are occurring. So the first zone is the approach. And this is just one of the typical boulders in Little Cottonwood. And you can see I've got 1, 2, 3 different zone 1s here for the approaches. These are all the social trails that are accessing this boulder. This one comes to the parking. These are just other social trails that come around other trails and other boulders. Zone 2 is your staging area. That's where you set up your pads, change, hang out with people a lot. Zone 3 is the actual climb. 4 is the termination, and 5 is the descent. And 5 can be tricky because sometimes it's a walk off the back, sometimes it's a down climb, sometimes you climb a tree down, which actually can cause some impact too. But the main zones that we're looking at for recreation impacts is Zone 1, Zone 2, and to a lesser extent, Zone 5. Okay, so what exactly are resource or ecological impacts? They are undesirable changes to soil, vegetation, and wildlife and water. And these result from visitor recreation use. These are occurring from climbers. Now, the thing about impacts is that impacts happen. I mean, there's no way of getting around it. We're going to go out there, we're going to climb, we're going to boulder, we're going to put impact on the land. And impacts themselves is not necessarily evil. They're not bad. It's just so at what point do we say that there's too much impact occurring out there? And that's the key thing here. So keep in mind that also that these impacts, they don't happen separately. Everything is kind of combined together. So vegetation, soil, water, and wildlife, they're all combined together. And also keep in mind that for solutions for mitigating one impact can also have effects on other impacts. It could actually exacerbate some of the issues. So the specific climbing trampling impacts that I was interested in, and this is the basic thing you see for bouldering areas and climbing sites too, is the recreation site impacts, the trail impacts, and there's some additional impacts also that I was interested in. Go back. All right, recreation site impacts. Okay, vegetation and soil are the key things I was interested in and what I wrote up my monitoring plan for. So direct effects on vegetation that you'll see is trampling from us walking all over the vegetation is that we're looking at loss of ground cover, loss of shrubs, loss of trees, reduced plant vigor, height, reproduction capabilities, and introduction of exotic plant species potentially. The indirect effects of vegetation from trampling are changes to trampling resistant species, altered microclimates, and looking at soil, the direct effects that we have on it from trampling is loss of organic material, soil exposure, compaction, and erosion. Indirect effects, reduce pore space and moisture, and increase water runoff, which will give you erosion. So looking at a typical bouldering site again, under the climbing routes is where you're going to see most of the soil compaction. You can see it pretty obviously right here. Loss of organic litter, ground vegetation, shrubs, and trees. And notice again, the whole area around where the climbing is occurring here, we don't see shrubs, We don't see, this is all scrub oak here. You don't see any of it left over here. And this is all bare mineral soil. There's little organic material down here at all. And this is due to the placement of pads, use of spotters, socializing around the boulders, and to a lesser extent sometimes just modifications, leveling the ground, removing rocks, and cutting tree branches. Sorry. All right, additional site impacts that I was interested in is mechanical damage to mature trees. You find this around some of our boulders in Little Cottonwood. This is driving nails into trees, striking trees with axes, or felling trees. I'm also interested in profile truncation, and this is where you have erosion that occurs around the base of trees. Roots become exposed from minor over here to sometimes major. Eventually, you could have some die-off in the trees. You've noticed, at least in Little Cottonwood, they're oaks, and they're pretty hardy. It doesn't seem to really have an effect on it, but it also gives you a good indicator of the type of use that's occurring around these boulders. And the last one is campfire-related impacts. Since campfires are illegal in the canyon, you have to be half a mile away from the road to have a campfire. So I wanted to make sure that in the monitoring system that we had it down to look if there was fire damage and campfire impacts. And the usual things you find are fire pits, tree damage, wood removal, ash, unburned trash, as you see here, and charred rocks, which is just ugly. So looking at trail impacts, the direct and indirect effects on the vegetation of soil are very similar to what we looked at for recreation sites. It's about the same thing. But keep in mind that the one thing is that erosion is the most serious problem for trails, and it's the most permanent. That was Little Cottonwood 2 seasons ago from massive flooding down the trail. Additional trail impacts, the concern is looking at trail widening. This occurs often due to erosion right down the middle of the trail, and people will start spreading out because they don't want to either get their feet wet or more or less it's just tripping hazards with all the rocks. Parallel trails are similar to trails enlarging out, but usually you get islands off in the middle of it, and other trails will start off on it. And proliferation of visitor-created trails. And this is a pretty big issue these days with the Forest Service. They're looking pretty hard at the trails that we're creating to get to the crags and to our boulders. All right, this is not going. There we go. So the factors that affect trail resource impacts, there's two. There's the users and there's environmental. So you have to think about the type of users that are on the trail. So are they hikers? Are they bikers? Are they ATVers? Horses? The type of use is going to dictate some of the impacts that are going to occur. The amount of use, is it a low population that's using it, or is it a high population that's using it? And the user behavior. If you have a trail and you have water right in the middle of it, most people aren't going to go right through of it. If they're correct, they would just blaze right through it and get their feet wet, but most people don't want to do that, so they'll just go off to the side, and that in itself, of course, will start creating a wider trail. Environmental related factors are, think about the vegetation, the soil types that the trail is put into, be it in the desert, are you up in the mountain, are you in deciduous forest, what kind of soil is a big part of this too. The topography, meaning like is the trail nice, designed quite well and it contours, or is it go straight up the fall line? And the climate. Are you in an area that gets a lot of rain and a lot of snow, or are you in a desert where you barely get any at all? And just remember that both of these things contribute to trail degradation over time. It's the users and the environmental factors. All right, type of trails. And I throw this in because, as I said earlier, that social trails are a really big issue right now with the Forest Service. Specifically in Utah, Uinta Wasatch Cache National Forest, we cannot put any tools down on social trails at all, any of them, without at this point having to go through the NEPA process. So, what exactly are these social trails? They're informal, visitor, and created, right? They're usually designed, constructed, or maintained by professionals. They're not, I should say. And they're more concerned in management due to the increased potential impacts from the inadequate designs because they're just blazed up something, paralignments, locating the trail through fragile substrates, vegetation, and vulnerable wildlife habitat. Yeah, and the designs attributes increase susceptibility to erosion, truncation, trail widening, and muddiness. All right, so that's one of our typical social trails that you find in Little Cottonwood. And on the flip side is you have these formal trails. Maybe they're designed by professionals, often they're not. Usually they're just old social trails that have been incorporated within the Forest Service's system. They have a nice number on it, and then any money that goes towards trail maintenance is put towards these trails because they're formal trails. And a lot of times, they're not even good trails. They could still be really horrible trails that they're constantly maintaining. But that, since it's a formal trail, you could touch it. You could put tools on it, and you can work on it as much as you want. So, and a lot of times, there's no, like I said, there's no difference. And even really well-designed trails are still going to have impacts and maintenance issues in the future. So, a little bit difference between social and formal trails. Now, trails to bouldering areas are, let's see. Usually they're just trails by a few people that want to access new boulders, right? They just pioneer into a new area. They're developed along the fastest route to bouldering areas from the parking area and between different boulders within a site. They're typically primitive, steep, and rarely improved. Sometimes they are, though. And once established, the frequency of use increases. It's highly probable that soil erosion, vegetation trampling, and multiple trails, along with other trail impacts will occur. So again, trails at bouldering areas, for the most part, I would say 99% of the time, they are all social trails. Okay, additional issues besides recreation site, and trail impacts are litter. And this is mostly an aesthetic impact. Whoops, that's not litter. That is the human waste, which is the same almost. Aesthetic impact from microtrash, small cigarettes, candy wrappers, to like large caches of just pure garbage, from bottles to washing machines and all that. Obviously, a lot of this can be just taken out really fast and the area can be cleaned up, but it's something that nobody likes to see out there. Human waste disposal is, again, aesthetic impact. It also can be a source of contamination of water sources, and you can use this as an indicator of the type of use that a bouldering area is receiving. Unfortunately for us, go back, graffiti is a serious problem. It's horrible. So it's an aesthetic impact. It's just everywhere in Little Cottonwood. Every time you turn around, there's taggers going up there, and they love boulders. They just go crazy on it. Again, I use this as an indicator to see what kind of use the boulder is getting. That being, is it climbers are there, or is it just a bunch of partiers going out there? And usually when you see that, it's just a bunch of partiers out there. And the final one is chalk. And while chalk is really more of an aesthetic impact for us, and for, not really for climbers, I should say, but for other folks that use the land, I used it as an indicator to show what kind of level that the boulder was receiving. And by going out, you could tell pretty fast. Yeah?
What kind of cleaning do you use to get the graffiti paint stuff off the rocks?
We've done sandblasting.
Is there a certain kind of a sandblast grit you use?
This big monster we had, and then big compression.
Environmental issues over types of sand you use?
What did we use? We used this nasty green stuff with full gear. It's horrible to do it. We did it last year a couple times, and the year before that a couple times, and it's actually one time we went and did it, and that night someone came out and re-tagged the whole thing. So we haven't done it in a while. It's out of control. You can also go in with solvents and brushes.
The reason why I bring it up, we go through the same thing in our adopted correctly.
The cleaning up graffiti.
Yeah, we get graffiti when you're right after 1,000 feet.
Yeah. We've had people that just are ready to go up there and just stalk out boulders and wait for people. I don't know. That's vigilance. I can't really condone that. So. Yeah, it comes back all the time, though. It doesn't matter how much we go and clean it. It's always there. Okay, so those are the impacts that we're looking at and that we're interested in. And so now we have to figure out these indicators. And indicators are, these are the measurable physical, ecological, and social variables to track trends and progress to desired goals and conditions. And we want to select appropriate indicators when we're developing a system. So we should do multiple indicators. You don't just go out and just measure graffiti. That doesn't really help. You want to go out and you want to see how much erosion is occurring. You want to see if vegetation is diminishing. And then all those other aesthetic qualities if it's important to your area. But usually it's the evaluation of soil, vegetation, the aesthetic qualities. And this will provide management reliable baseline resource conditions. It tells how serious problems are and identify changes. So proper indicators are really important. And real fast here, there's a couple ways to think about picking out these indicators, the criteria for them. There's 5 of them. You want to have meaningful measures. So the quality of information will be based on a scale of measurement. The more quantitative it is, the better. Ordinal scales are good to use too, but the more precise measurement you do, the better it's going to be. They want it to be accurate. You want to show that the measurements are as close to the true condition on the ground. Precision means like how many different people could come out there and do the same process, and it would be very similar. So you want to be very precise. Efficiency is the time, the expertise, the money it's going to take to do the process, and the sensitivity. So you want to be able to see subtle changes over time. And so again, precise measurements are really key to see that. So common trail indicators that we're looking at is you want to look at the number of trails, the length of your trails, and the density of social trails, meaning how many social trails are next to each other. You're going to be measuring, for the most part, your tread width, soil erosion, root exposure, and muddiness. There's other things also you can do as indicators, but those are the main ones. For recreation site indicators, common indicators are the number of visitor-created recreational sites and the site size. So the recreational site itself in a bouldering, I think of it as, think of the boulder itself as like the fire pit. And like at a campsite, you have the fire pit in the middle, and then you have all that activity just around the fire ring, and that's where all that impact's occurring. So for boulders, it's like the same way, except the boulder is like the fire pit. And usually all around that boulder is where you're going to see all that impact occurring. So if you look at the exposed soil and the number of trees with exposed roots, that can give you the amount of organic horizon disturbances that are occurring there, and the soil compaction and the erosion. And damage to ground cover and vegetation, you monitor by measuring the reduction in vegetation density from on-site, where the impact's occurring from off-site. And the aesthetic behavior and indicators, reminder, are dynamic. So, what you deem as being wrong or might be an issue might not be for somebody else, and they're really hard to measure in itself because it's more qualitative than quantitative. So, but if it's important to you, use it. So human waste, trash, tree damage, graffiti, campfires. For that bouldering area, for your climbing area, if those are impacts that are occurring, you should have it on your assessment system. Okay, so when I was doing this, I kind of figured out what I wanted to do. I figured out what the indicators I wanted to utilize. And then I had to figure out, well, how do I put this whole thing together? Going out in the field and gathering all this information. And over time, most of the research that's been done before has been on campsite, mostly wilderness campsite inventory is where it comes from. And so there's 3 different types of recreation impact assessment systems that you can go off of. And the first one is a photographic. And photographic is great. You can take the photos, you can come back to the office, you have it on the file. The key thing when you're doing photographs, though, is that it's still not just going out, taking a photo, and leaving. You still need to do pretty precise measurements of where that photo is being taken. And you can see in here, from 1986, you can see all the vegetation here. And then 1990, the same photo. But you can also see that it is the exact same photo. Like, it's in the same spot, the angle's the same, focal point's the same, and you can really see the difference here. So if you're going to use photos, which you should, because it's great, you still need to be very precise. On the flip side, you have things like this, and this is from the Bishop Field office, and they have a monitoring for the tableland, looking at vegetation, and you have these 4 different photos, and every single photo is a little bit different, and so it's really hard to gauge exactly what changes are occurring on the land off of these 4 photos. So again, you want to be very precise when you're using photos. So overall, photos should just be a part of your system, your assessment system. And again, everything should be based off of really true measurements as much as possible. So the second kind are condition classes, and this is based off of Frizzell's work in, it was like 78. So the indicators that he looked at for campsites was like tree mortality, erosion, vegetation loss, mineral soil exposure, and tree root exposure. And by just looking at that really quickly, you'd go to a site, you would just categorize what you see into these. We had 5 different condition classes, from 1 being like the lowest amount of impact to 5 being like the largest one. And The last one is multi-indicators, and this is where it gets a little bit more precise. You have rapid survey methods, which are kind of like condition classes. You set up these index ratings, so you have indicators over here, your vegetation, your damage to trees, et cetera, and then you have impact ratings from 3 to 5 usually, and underneath those are defined what impacts are occurring. And it's a very rapid system when you're out there. You can gather this information really fast. And once you figure out where everything's at, you can just tally it up here, and you get an overall index rating for it. And you use that as your basis for, for your management issues later on. I mean, it really is. It's like a condition class we just looked at, but it's a little bit more precise because you can see the changes later on. And the final one are precise measurement methods. This is more research level. You can use things like quadrants here, or you use really precise, really time-consuming, going in and measuring off of one point. So this gives you super preciseness, but it's very time-consuming. And for what I was looking at to do, like, that's too much. But at the same time, putting the system together, I realized that doing a multi-indicator is the way to go about it. I want to get as much information as possible to show what the impacts are around the boulders in Little Cottonwood. So the indicating system that I chose to use is based on Dr. Marion's 2007 study in Shenandoah National Park. He's kind of the guru when it comes to all this stuff now. And he's actually doing a lot of climbing-related impact studies. And it relies on measurements, permanent photo spots, and a condition class rating. So I went for all of it. There's all 3 of it in there. And from there, I just made up a form really fast. You have general site information, you describe location, and then inventory indicators. Site slope, tree canopy, use types, things of that nature. And then you want to go to start your impact indicators, and you need to figure out what your site boundaries are. And this is where it can get kind of confusing. This is where the expertise kind of helps, like being out in the field a lot, because you want to see where the difference is occurring from that the site, the impacted site, to what the natural site looks at. So you're looking at vegetation height, topography, soil types, things of that nature. And you end up doing is just bringing out flagging, and you pin around it as much as you can. And then the measurements, the way I chose to do it is using this, there's a common site here. So the measurement I used is the geometric figure method. So basically you take these simple circles, squares, triangles, and you superimpose them on the ground. You can flag off the spots you want. You do these measurements, and they go on the form, and you can get a really good idea of the square footage of the impact that's occurring. This is like the biggest challenge for me to figure out how to actually do it around a boulder, because there's so much impacts that are going on around it. And when went out and practiced it on one boulder, I realized that this is a really good system, and it does pretty adequately give you a good idea of the square footage of the impact. And I also have a condition class system, and I added one more, so from class 0 to class 5, and this is a really good indicator of the overall general condition of that site. And and I had a photo documentation, so just another form, doing photo points on it, being as precise as possible, using GPS camera sites for it, some drawings, focal point, all the data is possible for it. I would have photos, but my hard drive failed, so I lost all the photos. So back up your stuff. And the big thing is the manual. You have to write everything down, the procedures, so people could come back and they could follow the exact protocol that you've created to, again, to be precise. So they can see what you've done, and they can do the exact same thing to figure out what changes have to occur. Again, another very time-consuming process, but it's done now. All right, the other one is, so trail impact assessment systems. So one assessment system to do the sites, another whole system to look at the trails. And trails are another really difficult one to assess because there's so many of them. There's so many social trails around boulders. I couldn't believe how many there are when you start looking around. It's like you have these nodes and links going everywhere. So again, I have to look at what the research said, and there's a couple of different systems. You could do a condition class, which you have all these indicators, but you're putting everything into a class 1 to class 4. So that's one way you could do it. Another way is you do sample-based, and this is getting into, again, research level work, where you can do things like called systematic point sampling systems, where you go and you just pick an interval on the trail. So when I say every 300 feet, so you walk with the measuring wheel, and at every 300 feet you stop, and you do all your measurements right there. And then again, in the future, you have to be able to go right back to that spot to do the measurements again to see what kind of changes has occurred. Another part of that is point quadrants, which is not used as much anymore, but that's your basically sampling indicators based off of like something specific, like the vegetation, and you're doing quadrants on the side of it and measuring that, again, on an interval. The last one are called census-based types of system, and there's selectional evaluation systems, which are not used anymore really either. Last time was like the 1979, and that's just like breaking up a park in a whole bunch of different sections, and each of those sections broken up, and on and on and on and on and on. It doesn't actually give you a really good indication of like the full picture, but just small little sections of the trail of what kind of impact's occurring. And the final one are problem assessment systems, and this is where you predefine your impact indicators, and you record these on every part of the trail. And this provides information, the extent, frequency, and distribution of trail impacts. So this is the system that I want to use for looking at the social trails around boulders, because I want to know exactly what's on the ground and what are the issues there. And so by having something set up where you can just, you know what you're looking for, you can stop there and you can write it down, or you can take a photo of it, and then you have a good baseline of what work needs to be done. So again, I went off of Dr. Marion's work in 1994 that he did some trail monitoring in Great Smoky Mountains, and looked at measuring predefined impact indicators, recording the distribution of trail maintenance and design features, photographing specific sections of trails that need urgent maintenance attention to. And these are the parameters I set up. So there's 3 different categories. There's an inventory, there's resource condition, and there's design and maintenance. So I'm looking at new trails, end trails. Reference points are the key spots where other trails connect off of that social trail that you're inventorying. I'm looking at the condition of such as trail incision, root exposure, excessive width between 3 to 6 feet, excessive width greater than 6 feet, wet soil, running water on trail, and multiple tread. Those are things that I'm looking for. Design and maintenance features is excessive grades, and I chose just greater than 20%. A good trail would be between 10 and 12%, but found that about 20% and up, it gets really bad. Trail corduroy, drainage dips, water bars, lateral drains, retaining walls, culverts, and steps. If anything has been put in those social trails, I want to inventory them. So had to make a whole bunch of codes up to show everything, so you can go out in the field and quickly put all this data down. And this is the typical form. And we're doing waypoints with GPS, waypoint 1 and 2. Here's where my codes go. Using a measuring wheel and also using a GPS to constantly just track it the whole time so we can get a good map out of it. And again, a manual. Got to show how you can do this in the future. This system was really fast once you got it. The limiting factor was using a GPS unit. That was the hardest thing of it, actually like capturing the data that you needed. All right, so this kind of puts me at where I'm at today with this project. So I've got all these manuals. I've got it all protocol set up. I've gone out and I tested it. I know how it's going to work. And now I just need to go out and actually get this work done. And so this is where I'm at. So it hasn't been done yet. So basically what I need to do now here is you get a small group of evaluators to conduct the field work. You want to do this in a short period of time. The faster you can do it, the better. But you want to have adequately trained people, and you want to consistently judge these indicators for accurate results. That's why you want to have a small amount of people. And you don't want to have every weekend different people coming in. You want to have set people that this is what they're doing. Evaluators that you can have LCO volunteers who are interested in it, Latin agencies employees, cooperative research contract with the university, or you can just contract it out. And you want to conduct these at the end of the bouldering season when the sites have been used extensively, but you really want to do it before the leaves fall, because you don't want to have that organic litter there. You're just going to have misinterpreted data. And you want to conduct this at an interval of at least 5 to 10 years. So once you conduct the field work and you have this data, you need to analyze the data. You need to digitally encode it into some type of system, preferably an ArcGIS. And then you start doing your stat work. So you want to look at such things as the number and distribution of your bouldering sites, social trails, looking at all these inventories, indicators, the impacts, resource, design, maintenance parameters, and finally, you want to integrate this to a GIS database for mapping and spatial analysis. Okay, you want to evaluate your impact accessibility. And this kind of goes back to the beginning with the, looking at limits of acceptable change and the VERP systems. You're going to go back into the management plans, and you're going to decide the data you collect and like what we see on the ground, is it acceptable? So you want to evaluate again for the plans, environmental, and cultural factors. So here's a few things. For instance, so social trails that descend up the falling line will be less acceptable than a properly designed trail. You know, that's pretty obvious, right? Multiple social trails leading to one site are probably less accessible than one trail would do. All right. Archaeological sites might not be very acceptable at all to be having recreational activities around it. And illegal activities are definitely less acceptable than allowable recreational activities. And these illegal activities are specifically, I was looking at graffiti and fire rings. So by evaluating the accessibility of impacts, we can decide if mitigation should occur. And mitigation comes in two different types. You can do site mitigation, and you can do education outreach mitigation work. Come on now. Okay, so for site mitigation, let's go back here once. So some strategies for bouldering sites and the associated impacts that you can do is like, you can redesign or decommission social trails, and you can construct new trails. That's a nice thing if you can do it. You can install trail structures. So that last picture you saw before, that's the same fall line that went down, and now we have structures on it that's helping mitigate the soil erosion that was occurring there. You can close and restore impacted areas. That gets a little bit more hardcore, putting up fences and signages, but more it's the fences, like stay out of this area. You can stabilize sites with rock retaining walls. That's actually a client project that we did, but you can also utilize something like that around boulders. And you can utilize physical borders to prevent expansions. You can use that. Rocks, junking things, just pushing people not to go to a specific area. And some visitor management techniques that we can use. We can attempt to minimize impacts by altering behavior through education and through regulations. And education and regulations sometimes kind of go together all the time, unfortunately. But education is the first thing you want to do. So you can add trail signs to a specific area, from simple things like, hey, just stay off of it, to something a little bit more intense with a little bit more education on it, saying here's the reasons why we don't want you to go onto this area. You can use directional signs for trails. That would help limit impacts of new social trails possibly being created. Kind of a contention in Little. People really don't want to have signs anywhere. On-site educational regulation signs, from simple things like a carcinite sign by our one ARC site that we have, to something right at a trailhead of a climbing area. You just have some information out there about what we'd like climbers to do. And regulate the use of waste bags is another thing you can do if that is an issue. Design and construct kiosks that identify trailheads. I think this is a really important thing, but if you're going to build a kiosk, it's also important to build a really good kiosk with adequate information. And there's actually been studies on like what makes a good kiosk and the information that's on there, opposed to bad ones. So a good kiosk is something with, and shows that, lots of pictures on it. You want to be drawn into pictures and not lots of information, because then you overwhelm people. But you can design a really good one and attract people to it, and you can get that educational and, if needed, regulations to the climbers and other recreation users, of course. The other one you can do is develop an educational brochure. So there's one up here from City of Rocks. This is from Indian Creek. These are great, full of information, map. They should be free. They should be everywhere for that specific area for people to get on it. We actually had one for Salt Lake Climbers Alliance, but it's out of print and only have one hard copy. It's like floating around anymore. But this is something that can be utilized a lot more. And you can coordinate with your local climbing gyms and your local outdoor stores to get that information out to the climbers. And finally, it's us. It's the LCOs. We get that information out. We go through our web information. We do email blasts to people, social media, our stewardship projects, other events like fundraisers. Anytime you can get that message out to the climbers, the better it's going to be.